Good evening, everyone. My name is Christopher Shannon. I'd like to welcome you to my presentation, The Village Green, the Clancy Brothers, Irish Music, and the Greenwich Music Folk Revival. First, a little bit about myself. I am still Christopher Shannon, and I'm an associate professor of history at Christendom College here in Front Royal. A bit of a scholar of sorts of Irish-American culture and history, and that's what you'll be getting a taste of tonight. I have published a book on Irish-American film in the first half of the 20th century called Bowery to Broadway, about kind of the Irish in the American city. This presentation tonight comes from the book I'm working on now, which is a study of the revival of Irish music in post-war America. Before I go any further, I would like to thank Samuel's Public Library for hosting me. We had planned this all back in March when everyone was living, and now we have to make our kind of technological adjustments here. I apologize also, we had originally tried to do this as a more kind of interactive Zoom type presentation. We did the technical run through on Monday. It didn't work out all that great in terms of the sound and transmission of sound, but still here we are. So a YouTube version of this presentation, but I promise you I am not in my mother's basement. We are actually in Samuel's Public Library, and there are people at the library that I would like to thank for this opportunity. First of all, the now departed, at least from the library, not from this world, Kitty McKean, who was my first contact here at the beginning of the year and was the one who was gracious enough to allow me to give this presentation. Additional staff, those who followed in her wake: Sharon Fisher, Aaron Rooney, excuse me. I can mess up an Irish name like that. Aaron Rooney, Early Moya, and Jessica Sayers. Early and Jessica were the kind of the technical support, if you will, and Early is the kind of the master, the DJ master of the technology right here. Okay, before I go any further, I'll just start with a song. Guess that's a tune. I went down to New York town one day. I went down to New York town one day. I went down to New York town one day. Singing, I was broke, I did not have a dime. I was broke, I did not have a dime. I was broke, I did not have a dime. Singing, every man has a little hard luck sometime. Every man has a little hard luck sometime. Every man has a little hard luck sometime. A singing, leaving town ain't ever coming back again. Leaving town ain't ever coming back again. Leaving town ain't ever coming back again. I sing it, Well, that was not an Irish song. That was not a song by the Clancy Brothers, but in its own roundabout way, that song and the man who sang it is essential to the story that I'm going to tell this evening, the story the revival of traditional Irish music in America and in Ireland. That man is the person we see on the slide here, Woody Guthrie, the famous Dust Bowl balladeer, icon of a generation of American folk singers, most prominent among them, Bob Dylan. Guthrie rose to fame in the 1930s during the Great Depression, the Great Dust Bowl that swept through Oklahoma and the Plains states. Following a great migration of farmers westward in the 1930s, Guthrie came across the likes of the novelist John Steinbeck, who was also inspired by the events of the Dust Bowl. John Steinbeck, the author of the famous novel The Grapes of Wrath. Here we have the novel and the film version made in 1940 by Irish-American John Ford. Again, so Woody Guthrie kind of rose to fame in the context of the Great Depression and this great Dust Bowl, singing songs of the people. He's probably best known today for his song, This Land Is Your Land. That's something I was taught in grammar school. And a fairly tame, more kind of populist ballad, if you will, fairly unpolitical, just celebrating the people of America. But at the same time, most of Guthrie's songs were uncompromising songs of the hardships of the people, that more than a little dabbled in the radical politics of the time, including communism. Here we have a famous picture of Guthrie with his guitar, and I don't know if you can read it there, but the little sticker on the guitar says, "This machine kills fascists." Communists weren't the only ones who wanted to kill fascists in the 1940s. Americans did too. We did, after all, fight a war against the fascism of Hitler, and in that war, we were actually aligned with the communist power of the Soviet Union. So Guthrie's radical politics, you could somewhat slide under the radar in the 1940s. He actually served in the war, served in the Merchant Marines and the Army, where his military duties included writing songs warning of the dangers of venereal disease. So he put his musical talents into the service of his country in the most important way. But when the war ended and the Soviet Union became our enemy, Woody Guthrie's politics became a problem. Certainly a barrier to him, a barrier to his commercial success, because he is trying to make it as a kind of professional folk singer, if you will. Given the marginality of his politics, this Dust Bowl balladeer decided to settle down in New York City, where his politics, let's say, maybe weren't so marginal, where you could find kind of like-minded people, politically like-minded people, and ultimately musically like-minded people. It is there that Guthrie found a home and really became the icon of a growing cultural scene that mixed radical politics and folk music, of all things. It's kind of interesting, the most traditional of musics and the most radical of politics. Guthrie was getting on in years at the time, and he would soon develop a life-threatening disease. But in his time in New York, he was able to kind of build up a coterie of kind of followers to carry on his tradition. Most prominent of them, Pete Seeger. And Seeger would be the enduring voice of this tradition for the rest of the 20th century. But Guthrie and Seeger together, and here we have it's kind of a small image, but take my word for it, this is Guthrie and Seeger playing together. They became the nucleus of a folk music revival in New York City. Again, kind of irony here, the least traditional, the least folky place in America, New York City, the biggest city in the country, became the center of this folk music revival. Not New York City in general, but one particular neighborhood, the neighborhood of Greenwich Village, which had long been a center of kind of radical politics and art and such. But in the post-war period, this became a kind of a unique center of folk music, the mixing of folk music and radical politics. Just to put some images to this folk music scene, some of you might be familiar with this from a fairly recent movie by our friends, the Coen brothers, their film Inside Llewellyn Davis, which came out in 2013. This film kind of memorialized in a somewhat satirical way this folk music scene that I'm going to be talking about this evening. It featured recreations of famous folk music performers from the 1950s and early 1960s. Among them, a group of four men, unnamed in the film, four men wearing thick Irish sweaters. The four men that would become the model for this talk, the Clancy brothers and Tommy Macomb. This is the image of the Clancy brothers and Tommy Macomb from the film. Next, I'll show you the real Clancy brothers and Tommy Macomb. Now, I don't know how the fat guy got in there, if that's just Coen Brothers snark or what, but none of the Clancys were fat. Again, so they started to get bald, but none of them were fat. But I think, again, just kind of Coen Brothers snark going on there. But this is the Clancy brothers and all of their Aaron sweater glory, something that we'll talk about later here. Now, most of the participants in this folk music revival came to New York City again to sit at the feet of Woody Guthrie and learn real American folk music. Most of these people who came were not from any folk area at all. They tended to be middle-class urban or suburban kids who were alienated from mainstream American society and were looking for something real and authentic. And they thought they found it in this folk music. And the folk music, it's diverse, but I think we can generally break it down into two main categories. Either the black blues of the Mississippi Delta or the white Appalachian, what we might now call bluegrass, but at the time they even called it hillbilly music. So the kind of banjo picking hillbilly music, or the black blues from the Delta. And here's a couple of images of the people that flocked to New York City. This actually, the man playing here is Rambling Jack Elliott, and I think he kind of represents or kind of epitomizes the kind of ironies of this folk music scene. Rambling Jack Elliott was a Jewish kid from New York. He was the son of a dentist, but he kind of remakes himself as, I'm a Rambling Jack Elliott, and people didn't know the difference. And Bob Dylan would later do that himself. And Elliott and others like these people were kind of putting on a mask of being folk singers and folk originals. They all aspired to do that. And one historian, because of this irony, has dubbed them city billies. That they weren't really they weren't from these areas. Some of the traditional musicians did come to New York, but most of the musicians in this folk music revival were people who were not from folk cultures at all, but looking for something authentic and real. In this respect, the Clancy brothers were different and followed their own kind of path into this folk music revival. They came to New York not to sit at the feet of Woody Guthrie, but to be stage actors and to immerse themselves in the broader kind of culture of Greenwich Village, most associated with the literary world, the likes of particularly Dylan Thomas, who was famous for drinking himself to death at this tavern, the White Horse Tavern. So everybody, actually in memoirs of people Americans that came to New York at this time, they will talk about how I had to go to the White Horse Tavern. I had to sit where Dylan Thomas sat when he drank his last pint. This kind of cult of the tortured artist. The singing, the Clancy brothers and their singing career was kind of by accident. They were discovered singing songs in the back room of this tavern, singing songs just for fun. In singing these songs, singing these Irish songs, they were very distinct from Irish city billies because, in a sense, though they didn't intend to be folk singers, they didn't have to put on a mask. They didn't have to pretend to be Irish or anything like that. They were people from the cultures that they were singing of. So in a sense, they were the real deal. And it's impossible to minimize the importance of that. The people, even you hear interviews with Bob Dylan and stuff later, that's like he was just kind of overawed and intimidated by their authenticity because they were the real thing. And Bob Dylan knew that he was a fake. He's a great fake, but he was a fake. So I want to start by giving a little bit of background on the Clancys and then get into the songs. Again, with the contrast between the Clancys and these other folk musicians, many of these aspiring folk musicians, again, were sons and daughters of the middle class, fleeing middle class prosperity because they're alienated from it, looking for something real. The Clancy's very different. They came to America looking for prosperity. They'd known poverty and said, okay, we've been there and done that. And they wanted their little piece of the American dream. Now, to be fair, the Clancy's weren't fleeing absolute poverty, but certainly fleeing a lack of economic opportunity in post-war Ireland. Ireland was never a land of economic opportunity. Irish people had been coming to America in droves since the middle of the 19th century. So in some sense, the Clancy's are in this great tradition of Irish immigration to the promised land of America. First, to break down the Clancy's individually, there's a picture taken around the time that Tom, the figure on the right, and Paddy, the figure, top figure is Tom, and the bottom figure is Paddy. And then later, their younger brother, the kid brother, Liam, the pretty one, he came a bit later. The Clancy's came from a region, the dark green region on this map here, Carrick-on-Suir in County Tipperary. This kind of Tipperary, you can see, it's fairly centrally located in Ireland. It was not a hotbed of traditional Irish culture, and the Clancy's weren't, straight off the farm or anything like that. Their father was, I guess, what we would call lower middle class. He ran an insurance business, and he wanted to pass it on to his sons. He wanted, Clancy's insurance to be Clancy and Sons insurance, and for most Irish people at the time, that was opportunity. Wow, I can, be a part owner of a business. But his sons just simply weren't interested. It's an opportunity that many in Ireland would have jumped at. They said, no, we want to see a wider world. In terms of their acting, that's something that they just kind of stumbled across in their travels. They sought opportunity through immigration. At that time, it was easier to emigrate to Canada because of the long-standing, the continuing political connections between Ireland and the UK. The entry into Canada was part of the Commonwealth, so it was easier for Irish people to get into Canada and then maybe just slip across the border into America. And so Tom and Paddy first went to Toronto and then to Cleveland. And just in this process of, well, what are we going to do here? Looking for opportunity, they fell into acting. Now, proceeding from Cleveland, they had originally planned to go to Hollywood. That's where you go to be an actor, right? Except the car broke down. So, there's a series of circumstances here. So they went to New York instead. It's closer. They could afford there. But at the time, New York, of course, had a thriving theater scene. I think in some ways certainly a more thriving scene now then than now, because in addition to the stage, New York was also the home of early TV. And so a lot of these actors that were trying to make it on the stage, they could get good money quick, just in a bit part on a TV show. And the Clancy's actually did do that. I've seen one kind of film clip of Liam kind of dressed like a pirate, hey, no! So they did get work on TV. But again, they wanted, by the mid-1950s or so, they wanted to be serious actors on the stage. Their singing began, aside from just passing the time and having fun, their kind of group singing began first in an effort to raise money for a theater group that they had organized to produce Irish drama from the great repertoire of early 20th century modernist dramatists, Irish modern dramatists like James Synge and Sean O'Casey. So these are people that are aspiring to modern art. In addition to these fundraising concerts, they would also, of course, sing for their own entertainment at drinking places like the White Horse Tavern, which we'll keep coming back to here. Now, at the time that they're trying to be stage actors and singing in the back room of the White Horse Tavern, New York is not only crawling with aspiring folk singers, but also crawling with the inevitable scholar, the ethnomusicologist, who is hoping to document the thing. One such scholar was Diane Hamilton, or I should say Diane Hamilton Guggenheim, or Diane Guggenheim Hamilton. She was, yes, of the Guggenheim, the very wealthy Guggenheim family. Another, you could say, another alienated, more than middle class alienated rich person who was looking for something real in culture. She found it in folk music, and not unusual for rich people, especially rich women, to become patrons of the arts. The art of the day, one of the arts of the day was folk music. And she was there in the village trying to get the real thing. Who better to go to than one of the Clancys, because he's the real thing, an actual Irishman singing Irish songs. She approached, first of all, Paddy Clancy, who was the oldest and kind of the leader of the group early on. And she approached him for leads, places that she could go in Ireland to seek out the roots of this music. Paddy directed her to his mother and sisters in Ireland, who still knew some of the old songs. Again, as I said before, Tipperary, not exactly the west of Ireland, Galway, kind of the heart of the traditional culture, but some of the songs still were still alive in the minds and memories of older people. Some of them actually were kind of continued on as part of in the school system, trying to maintain folk culture. But of course, you don't want to go to the schools, you want to go to people. And Ma Clancy knew a lot of these songs, sang them around the kitchen and such. And so Paddy sends Diane Hamilton over to his mother. Liam, the youngest, is still living at home at the time. He's living at home and wants to get out of, you could say metaphorically, his mother's basement. And so when Diane Hamilton comes, he's like, this is great home. He goes, I will be your native guide to music in Ireland. And so he takes her on a trip through Ireland to collect songs. One stop along the way through Ireland included a stop north, the northern part of Ireland, to the Macomb family. And this man, Tommy Macomb. Sarah Macomb, Tommy's mother, even more so, I think, than Ma Clancy, was a repository of these songs, and known as such. So Liam takes Diane Hamilton up there. He meets up with Tommy Macomb, who, just like him and his brothers, has an interest in theater and wants to, let's politely say, see the world or just get the heck out of Ireland. So Tommy Macomb and Liam Clancy soon, accompanying Diane Hamilton, they go back to New York. They join the older brothers, and they come under the patronage, if you will, of Diane Hamilton, who is very wealthy and very unstable mentally. And as there's Liam Clancy in his memoir, actually kind of talks about this. She was in love with him and wanted to marry him, and just it was an awkward situation. But she had the money, and so they maintained that relationship. Though he's always trying to keep her at more than arm's length. So Hamilton becomes their patron, the patroness, I should say. Back in New York, she offers them the chance of a lifetime. She's going to set them up with her own record label, Tradition Records, where they will record traditional Irish music. They're, certainly their own, but that of other traditional musical records. It is Tradition Records, so it's not exclusively Irish, but she is closest to the Clancys, and the first album released on Tradition Records is an album of Irish rebel songs sung in a very kind of maybe rough, unprofessional style. The album was redone a few times to be cleaned up, but sung in, let's say, rough authenticity by the Clancys and Tommy Macomb. And here is the album cover, The Rising of the Moon. Interesting album cover designed by the award-winning modernist artist, Dublin-born Louis Le Brockie, and a very kind of minimalist, modernist look about it at the time, very jarring, especially when you compare it to some of the later albums where they're in their sweaters and just looking, let's have a drink. And another, just kind of a visual example of this mixture of kind of high modernist art and folk music at the time. So this is their first album, and now I'm going to do a few songs from that album. So we're getting to the music now, and I'll start with the title track, The Rising of the Moon. This is a song about the Great Rebellion in Ireland in 1798, rebellion linked to the French Revolution, sometimes called the Year of the French. People might know that historical novel, The Year of the French. It was Ireland is kind of caught up in the revolutionary spirit of the time, and they're hoping that the French will liberate them from English rule. And this is a song about that rebellion.
Excuse my technical difficulties here, but okay. Close enough for country, as they say, close enough for Irish. So here is the song, The Rising of the Moon. Oh, then tell me, Sean, old fellow, tell me why you hurry so. Hush, uncle, hush and listen, and his cheeks were all aglow. I bear orders from the captain, get ye ready the weekend soon. For the pipes must be together at the rising of the moon. At the rising of the moon, at the rising of the moon. For the pipes must be together at the rising of the moon. Come me, Sean, old fellow, there the gathering is to be. At the old spot by the river, right well known to you and me. One word more to signal token, whistle up the marching tune. With your pike upon your shoulder at the rising of the moon. At the rising of the moon, at the rising of the moon. With your pike upon your shoulder at the rising of the moon. Out of many a mud wall cabin I were watching through the night. Many a manly heart was pounded for the blessed morning light. Murmurs ran along the valley like the banshee's lonely croon. And the boughs and pipes were flashing at the rising of the moon. At the rising of the moon, at the rising of the moon. And the boughs and pipes were flashing at the rising of the moon. There beside the singing river, that black mass of men were singing. High above their shining weapons flew our own beloved green. Death to every foe and traitor, forward strike the marching tune. And hurrah, me boys, for freedom, 'tis the rising of the moon. 'Tis the rising of the moon, 'tis the rising of the moon. And hurrah, me boys, for freedom, 'tis the rising of the moon. Well, they fought for dear old Ireland, and the full bitter was their fate. Oh, what glorious pride and sorrow fills the name of a 98. Yet thank God there still are beating hearts in manhood's burning new. Who would follow in their footsteps at the rising of the moon. At the rising of the moon, at the rising of the moon. Who would follow in their footsteps at the rising of the moon.
Quick water break. That song, in case you forgot, was The Rising of the Moon. And it's a song that kind of raises certain questions about what's traditional. This is not a song directly from the experience of the rebellion of 1798. It's something that was written in the middle of the 19th century to inspire later rebellions, because most of the 19th century, about every 20 years or so, there was some kind of rebellion, and nothing as significant as something like in the year of 98, let's just say roughly like 40,000 people were killed, 40,000 Irishmen were killed. The body counts vary, but it was a significantly violent event. A lot of these rebellions from the 19th century didn't have so impressive a body count, but the songs kept coming. And this one in particular is meant to inspire an uprising in the 1860s, one that of course failed. They all fail, right? But great songs come out of failure. Great songs, but with different themes. The next song I'm going to sing for you, Bullaboo, is also from this album, but gives us a kind of a different view of 98. 98, again, as I said before, was the rebellion was tied to the French Revolution, very kind of Enlightenment, modernist, if you will, political event, one generally hostile or at best indifferent to religion. The problem in Ireland, though, was that the vast majority of people were religious. They were Catholics, and their persecution, their political persecution, was tied up with a religion. And so when this kind of continental Enlightenment radical politics comes to Ireland, it gets kind of filtered through Catholicism. And one of the great heroes of 98 in popular memory was in fact a Catholic priest. Excuse me. Where's my phone? Oh, here it is. It's right here. Me and technology. Father John Murphy, who led a rebellion in Wexford. And this song, Bullaboo, is a tribute to him. Again, it's a composition that we know who wrote it. It didn't come up, rise anonymously from the people. Patrick Joseph McCall wrote it in 1898 for the centenary. But still, it's powerful nonetheless. And I guess so not to overpower you, I'll step away from the microphone, even though I'll be doing this, we might call it a cappella. I'll get all authentic and say it's Shannos, that in traditional Irish music, of which the Clancys departed, singing would often be done a cappella, without musical accompaniment. And this song, though, when the Clancys do it, they have a kind of a harp in the background, at least in the later versions of this album. But I don't have a harp, and it's not really appropriate for strumming on the guitar, so I will just sing it Shannos, a cappella.
At Bullaboo, as the sun was setting o'er the bright green meadows of the Shannon, a rebel hand set the heather blazing and called the neighbours from far and near. Then Father Murphy from all the Kilcormac stirred up the rocks with a battle cry. Arise, arise, for I've come to lead you, for Ireland's freedom will fight or die. He led us on against the coming soldiers, the cowardly yeomen he put to flight. 'Twas at the Harrow the boys of Wexford showed a Bookie's regiment how man could fight. Look out for hirelings, King George of England. Search every country that breeds a slave. For Father Murphy from the county Wexford sweeps o'er the land like a mighty wave. At Vinegar Hill, o'er the pleasant Slaney, our heroes vainly stood back to back. The Yos of Tulla took Father Murphy and burned his body upon the rack. God grant you glory, brave Father Murphy, and hope and heaven to all your men. The cause that calls you may call tomorrow with another fight for the green again.
again, a song with an author. In this case, let's see what here. Patrick Joseph McCall. I think actually the picture of him. Nope, not him. Okay, don't have the picture of him. But, Patrick Joseph McCall. So again, a song with an author, at least in terms of the words, but the melody is a traditional one. This is something that we'll see that's very common in Irish music, to mix traditional melodies with contemporary words. Now, these words, of course, were about a real historic event and intended again to inspire action. Notice that the final verse of Rising of the Moon was, there still are men with passion in their hearts to fight for Ireland, even though the song ends sadly with Father Murphy being burned on the Bracken. It's like, the cause that calls you will call tomorrow. So these are highly politically charged ballads intended to inspire rebellion against England. But not all folk music, if you will, as it developed in the 19th century, had that kind of rough edge. And another song from this Clancy Brothers album is by somebody who represents, you could say, the softer side of the traditional music revival, a man named Thomas Moore, who is probably the most famous promoter of something like traditional Irish music. You see from the painting here, of course, Thomas Moore was not a peasant. He was, you could say, maybe like the city Billy of Dublin or something. He was from a middle-class family in Dublin, raised far from the roots of folk music, but he came across these folk melodies that had been collected in the 1790s. There was a sense in the late 18th century, an awareness that traditional Irish culture was dying out, and so the ethnomusicologists of the time, you see the Diane Hamiltons of the time, gathered all the old harpers together in Belfast and just said, play. And while the harpers played, they transcribed. And so there were several music collections that came out with very kind of scholarly transcriptions, not exactly made for entertaining the masses or anything, but that's what Thomas Moore did. He took these melodies and kind of reworked them for the least traditional of all instruments, the piano. Piano at the time, kind of the sign of middle-class prosperity for a family to have a piano, sit around the parlor, and maybe have one of your daughters play the piano. So he arranged them for this, for a kind of genteel audience, if you will, and kind of softened the rebel tradition by reducing it to kind of the spirit, not referring to specific events, if you will, just again general loss, spirit of rebellion and sad loss, and all that. And this song I'm going to do for you, The Minstrel Boy, is probably, is certainly one of his most famous, and it's one that appears on the Clancy Brothers' first album. So Clancy Brothers aren't too particular about authenticity either. Thomas Moore was kind of one of the great figures in Irish music, and they were happy to do one of his songs. And again, it's a song that would likely be accompanied by harp. Don't have the harp, and so it's one that I think stands up to, again, this kind of Seamus treatment, because the melody is so strong. And again, The Minstrel Boy.
The minstrel boy to the ward is gone, in the ranks of death you'll find him. His father's sword he is girded on, and his wild harps long behind him. Land of song, says the warrior bard, though all the world betray thee, one sword at least thy right shall guard, one faithful harp shall praise thee. Minstrel fell, but the foeman's chains could not bring his proud soul under. The harp he loved never spoke again, for he tore its cords asunder, and said, no chains shall sully thee, thou soul of love and bravery. Thy songs were made for the pure and free, they shall never sound in slavery.
So, again, a song by Thomas More, referring to, if you will, or acknowledging the rebel tradition, but a very kind of abstract rebel tradition, and not tied to any specific events that would have been within Moore's lifetime. Moore's place in the tradition of traditional Irish music is somewhat complicated, again, because he kind of smoothed off the rough edges and kind of made the music more civilized. And this is one of the big kind of tensions in not just traditional Irish music, but Irish culture. There's this problem of civilization, because for centuries, and to some degree even today, still to today, the English British looked down on the Irish as uncivilized, as savage. And the Irish were conflicted. On the one hand, they didn't want to be seen as savage. They wanted to show that they were respectable people, and I think you could see centuries later the Clancys. Their parents were like that. Their father, for example, their father, the kind of lower middle class insurance agent, he listened to classical music and such. They wanted to show that they were up to the standards of civilization, European civilization. But at the same time, they kind of resented the insults and kind of took a certain pride in being uncivilized. And so this next song I'm going to do, that was again also on the Clancy Brothers' first album, is a kind of is a hymn to uncivilization, a hymn to savagery. Again, an original composition written by a man named Carnegie, who would go on to write the Irish national anthem, the Soldier's Song. But this is his, I'd say, a very funny song. His ode to savagery called Whack for the Diddle, and this does need a guitar.
I'm savage. See, I can't deal with this technology. I'll tell you a tale of peace and love. Whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. Of the land that reigns all lands above. Whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. May peace and plenty be her share. Kept our homes from want and care. Oh, God bless England is our prayer. Whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. Whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. So we say, hip hooray, come and listen while we play. Whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. Now, when we were savage, fierce, and wild, whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. She came as a mother to a child, whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. Gently raised us from the slime and kept our hands from hellish crimes. She sent us to heaven in her own good time. Whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. Whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. So we say, hip hooray, God bless England, so we pray. Whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. Now, our fathers oft were naughty boys. Whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. Pikes and guns are dangerous toys. Whack for the diddle of the day-do-day. At Ballinagreen and a Bunker's Hill, we made poor England cry her fill. Britannia loves us still. Oh, whack for the diddle of the dido day. Whack for the diddle of the dido day. So we say, hip hooray, God bless England, so we pray. Oh, whack for the diddle of the dido day. Now, ye Irishmen, forget the past. Oh, whack for the diddle of the dido day. And dream of the day that's coming fast. Oh, whack for the diddle of the dido day. When we shall all be civilized, neat and clean, and well advised. Oh, to Mother England and be surprised. Oh, whack for the diddle of the dido day. Whack for the diddle of the dido day. So we say, hip hooray, God bless England, so we pray. Oh, whack for the diddle of the dido day. Yeah, I'll keep this guy on because I think I may need him later.
Okay, that, again, that song, in case you forgot, Whack for the Diddle, and again, they're kind of odes to savagery, a kind of satirical take on this contrast between English civilization and Irish savagery. Again, Irish folk culture often viewed, even by the Irish people themselves, as a kind of sign of backwardness. Again, it's tremendous, it's almost like self-hatred. And we see this kind of most powerfully with respect to the Irish language, which England did try to root out as the kind of the root of Irish culture. They said, these people are always going to be different as long as they speak that funny language, and so we have to get rid of it. And certainly when the education system came in, compulsory education of the 19th century, it was designed to destroy the Irish language. And Irish people themselves, somewhat ambivalent about it. Often they felt ashamed by it. Sometimes Irish peasants would just say, look, if you're going to make it in this world, you've got to speak English. Irish is no good. And so they would just encourage them to not speak Irish. But in the context of a folk revival, of course, the Irish language, that's even more mysterious. That's even more authentic. You know, that is the realest of the real things. And so the Clancys, again, certainly not native Irish speakers. And the stuff that I read about them, he doesn't really say where he got these songs from. My sense, especially given the one that I'm going to sing for you, is that he was still taught in the schools, and he was taught in the schools partly through songs, and I think they got it that way. But this, again, Irish language, the kind of most authentic aspect of Irish folk music. If I can get an image here. Okay, I think that was Paddy Carney. Sorry, I missed him. He's the man who composed Whack for the Diddle. But this next song I'm going to sing for you in Irish is called Immigrated, or Ned of the Hills. It's a song, traditional Irish language song, based on a real-life person, Edmund O'Brien, a dispossessed Irish noble of the late 17th century. Without going into all the details of Irish history, there's a whole tradition of songs in the Irish song tradition of highwaymen. I mean, every culture has those. But in highwaymen, it's kind of like a hero. You know, he robs from the rich, gives to the poor, you know, Robin Hood type thing. In the Irish tradition, though, there's a more kind of specific political subtext that many of these highwaymen are actually dispossessed nobles, that they've had their land taken away from them by the English in the wars of the 16th and 17th century. They've had to take to the hills for protection, but then they spend their life, like this man here, robbing nobles. But that's a dangerous business, and sometimes you could get into trouble for assisting these people. And this song, Immigrated, is, without translating it all for you, is the story of one of these dispossessed nobles he's looking for shelter, and he can't find it anywhere, and at the end of the song he has to leave. He has to leave Ireland for safety. Since it is in Irish, I will have to bring my little cheat sheet here, because I don't, some of the words are difficult, but here goes. This is Immigrated, and this is the only Irish language song on on the Clancy Brothers' first album, but this type of thing can certainly very much impress the folk music world of the Greenwich Village. So again, immigrated.
Frame. Shinamwe, I will fweer araga, arebu mohorish hunta, mishem manakrik, atapacha farfio, ahir shus lefta esklanta. Livil Sakovic, Karyanin Shidich, Moragori not been demona. Skowil Pudar Gutu, your head, your yard, Iskome Mishari. Spada mishamwi, which knocked us with york, Iskanda Nakagamarinya, Maheshragan skor, Mohran Hargangur, Iskani Vedagamarin. Nil Kadichakan, Istani Jamsan, Dorlakum Mokna Jena, Isko Kachimedur, Harfaragesier, Oisan Nakwilin de Mohilta.
The Irish language movement actually also went, the Irish language went through a kind of revival movement of its own in the 19th century, and was first intended to be a kind of an alternative to politics, a little like a much more difficult version of what Thomas More was trying to do, kind of connect to tradition, but in a non-political way. It was actually the Gaelic language worked to promote the language, actually founded in part by a Protestant, an Anglo-Protestant, and so that kind of ecumenical dimension to it was intended to kind of smooth over political differences. But the way that the language connected people to this kind of deep tradition, ultimately the language became a political movement. The great Irish nationalist Patrick Pearse said, a people without a language is a people without a soul. And that Patrick Pearse would go on to lead the final rebellion, if you will. Over 100 years after 98, the Irish would rebel against England, and this time for good, to a degree. This was finally the rebellion that enabled them to break with England. This was in 1916. It's called the Easter Rebellion because it took place on Easter morning, 1916, and that was symbolic. This was, Pearse drew on a lot of kind of pagan traditions in Celtic culture, but he was a Catholic, and so he drew on Catholic ones as well. He kind of wanted to mold them together, but clearly in the choice of Easter, the Catholic one wins out, and the rebirth of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, is a model for the resurrection of the Irish people. But even with that, the Irish can make a sad song out of it. So this next song I'm going to sing for you, which is also from the Clancy Brothers' first album. The hits just keep on coming from that album. It's called The Foggy Dew. It's probably the most famous song coming out of the 1916 rebellion. It was written by a Catholic priest, Father Patrick O'Neill. Again, one of these songs in which new words are put to an old melody. But so here we go, Foggy Dew, and we'll have to capo this, so just give me a second.
'Twas down the glen one Easter morn to a city fair rode I. There Ireland's lines of marching men in squadrons passed me by. No pipe did hum, no battle drum did sound its loud tattoo, but the Angelus bell or the Liffey swell rang out in the foggy dew. Right proudly high over Dublin town we flung out a flag of war. 'Twas better to die 'neath an Irish sky than at Sublad a Sudel bar. And from the plains of royal Meath strong men came moving through, while Britannia's Huns with their long-range guns sailed in through the foggy dew. 'Twas England bade our wild geese go, that small nations might be free. Their lonely graves are by Subla's waves on the fringe of the great North Sea. But had they died by Pierce's side, or fought with Cathal, their names we keep where the Fenians sleep beneath the shroud of the foggy dew. The bravest fell and the requiem bell rang mournfully and clear, for those who died that Easter tide in the springtime of the year. But the world did gaze in deep amaze at those fearless men but few, who bore the fight so that freedom's light might shine through the foggy dew.
Okay, yes, that's again that Foggy Dew, a song commemorating the rebellion of 1916. It was ultimately the successful rebellion that enabled Ireland to achieve some degree of independence from England. Of course, not all of Ireland. The northern province of Ulster, which was heavily Protestant, was kept separate, and that became a kind of point of contention. It's really still to this day. But Foggy Dew, again, probably the most famous song to come out of the 1916 Easter Rebellion. So songs like these made the Clancy brothers certainly a hit in the folk world, at least in the folk world of New York City. They began to get paying gigs as singers, and again, as kind of struggling actors, a paying gig doing anything was jumped upon, but again, they started to make more money singing than what they had originally come for acting. And part of this is because folk music itself was experiencing somewhat of a commercial breakthrough beyond the confines of Greenwich Village, largely due to the success of these people. Oops, sorry, these are the leaders of 1916. forgot about that. But this group, the Kingston Trio, and just look at the, certainly a lot slicker than anything that you would see in Greenwich Village, and this kind of slickness is also parodied in the Coen Brothers movie. But slickness or not, they were the biggest thing around at the time, and when you read on them, they hold these sales records, like sold more records than Elvis and Beatles put together, or stuff like that. So it's impossible to underestimate the power of the Kingston Trio, the popularity, just the sheer record sales of the Kingston Trio. And this made folk music in general more popular. It's kind of trickled down, and even if the Greenwich Village people might sneer at these people as fakers, college boys, they're like, will you pay us to sing? And so they were happy to do that. Interestingly, their breakthrough hit was titled Tom Dooley, certainly a name, and a song with Irish connections, though probably more kind of Scotch-Irish connections in the American South. But still, just they didn't choose this one in particular because it was Irish, but the fact that the folk song that they chose just happened to have these Irish connections, I think, does speak to those older and broader connections between Irish and American culture. But again, everybody benefited from the success of the Kingston Trio. The Clancys continued to perform and make money, and again, they had this kind of carte blanche at Tradition Records to do whatever they wanted, so they decided they would make another album of their songs. And the second one is called Come Fill Up Your Glass. So it's a collection of Irish drinking songs. So the first, all of this is very much to stereotype in some ways, but the first album, a collection of rebel songs. The second album, a collection of drinking songs. And I'm going to do a couple of them here that I think at least show the range of the drinking song. They're not all dumb. But this first one is called Finnegan's Wake. It's the story of an Irish hod carrier in Dublin. Hod carrier is pretty much a bricklayer. The hod is what he carries bricks on, as he often had to, buildings get tall, and so you have to climb up a ladder with the hod. And this is Mr. Finnegan, who likes to drink a bit. One day is climbing up the ladder with a hod full of bricks and falls and dies, but is magically resurrected. And this, as some of you may know, since we're in a library, I want to be a little literary here. Finnegan's Wake, a Dublin street ballad, was also the name of James Joyce's fourth and most incomprehensible of all novels. And just like in Ulysses, he took the story, the grand story of Ulysses, and translated it into Dublinese. You could say he took the street ballad of Finnegan's Wake and translated it into whatever. We're still trying to figure out what he was trying to say in it, but the fact is he took Joyce always had a kind of a popular ear. He was always tuned to what was going on in the streets around him. And so he took this otherwise kind of throwaway song and made it into the basis of his novel. And I'm sorry, oops, losing images here. So, again, now this song, Finnegan's Wake, just one little note on the performance history. Clancy Brothers did various versions of it. The one that I'm most fond of actually begins with them reading from the novel by James Joyce. They say, and now, by way of introduction, Tom will read you the entire novel, Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. They don't do that. They read some opening sections there, which I intended to do, but I noticed I forgot to bring my copy of Finnegan's Wake, so you'll just have to settle for the song. One little note, though, another performance note, this version that I'm going to do, they call it New Finnegan's Wake, because the James Joyce introduction, they did in Ulster. And this is kind of, the politics are interesting here. They became known internationally as Irish musicians, but back in Ireland, there's Irish and there's Irish. And when they went to Ulster to perform there was some kind of pride, hey, people care about things Irish, but they had to tone down the rebel songs. And so in some ways they did more of these drinking songs or love songs or things that were less political. But here we go. This is Finnegan's Wake.
Walker Street, a gentle Irishman, mighty hard. He had a brogue both rich and sweet, and to rise in the world he carried a hod. But you see, it's sort of a tippling way. With the love of the liquor, Tim was born to help him on his way each day, to jump for the creature every morn. Back for the hurrah, take your partner, well, the fellow interrupters shake. Isn't it the truth? I told you lots of fun at Finnegan's Wake. Now, one morning Tim felt rather full, his head was heavy, it made him shake. He fell off the ladder and broke his skull, so they carried him home, his corpse to wake. They wrapped him up in a nice white sheet and laid him out upon the bed. Plenty of candles around his feet and a couple of dozen around his head. Whack for the hurrah, take your partner, well, the fellow interrupted shake. Isn't it the truth? I told you lots of fun at the Finnegan's Wake. Now the friends assembled at the wake, and Mrs. Finnegan called for lunch. First they brought out teas and cakes, then pipes and tobacco and a whiskey punch. Then Biddy O'Brien began to cry. Such a lovely corpse did you ever see? Hurrah, Tim of Horlin, why'd you die? Ah, shut your mouth, says a Biddy McGee. Whack for the hurrah, take your partner, well, the fellow interrupted his shake. Isn't it the truth? Oh, little lots of fun at the Finnegan's Wake. Peggy O'Connor took up the job. Hurrah, Biddy, she says, you're wrong, I'm sure. Biddy gave it a belt in the gob and left us sprawling on the floor. Each side in war did soon engage. 'Twas woman to woman and man to man. Shillelagh law was all the rage, and a row and a ruckus soon began. For the hurrah, take your partner, well, the fellow interrupters shake. Isn't it the truth? I told you lots of fun at Finnegan's Wake. Then Mickey Maloney raised his head, and a bottle of whiskey flew at him. It missed and landed on the bed, and the whiskey scattered all over Tim. Bedad, he revives, see how he rises, Timothy rising from the dead, crying while he ran around like blazes, thunder and lightning if you think I'm dead. Back for the hurrah, take your partner, well, the fellow interrupters shake. Isn't it the truth? I told you lots of fun at the Finnegan's Wake.
Okay, again, Finnegan's Wake, one of the drinking songs from Come Fill Up Your Glass. And a rare occasion for again, the Clancys to make connections to the kind of modernist Irish literature that again they came to New York to perform on the stage. The Finnegan's Wake is a kind of a slapstick, if you will, though with deep spiritual meaning in terms of resurrection and the like. But again, a lot of the drinking songs, which are I enjoy very much, great songs, but they do kind of play into certain stereotypes of the Irish drinking and such. The Clancys, they were always kind of walking a fine line, if you will, on the drinking and the fighting and everything. But at least one of these drinking songs is very kind of deep and moving and profound. And I want to just, as a point of contrast with Finnegan's Wake, I want to perform that song, give you kind of another side of the Irish drinking experience. And this is a song called The Parting Glass. Again, it's one that lends itself to the kind of Shannon style, but I'll keep the guitar in me just to cut down on the transitions, because I will be doing some guitar songs later. But here is The Parting Glass.
Oh, all the money that e'er I spent I spend it in good company, and all the harm that e'er I did, alas, it was to none but me. But all I've done for want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me the parting glass, good night and a joy be with you all. If I had money enough to spend, and leisure time to sit a while, there is a fair maid in this land, who sorely has my heart beguiled. Her rosy cheeks and her ruby lips, I own she has my heart enthralled. So fill to me the parting glass, good night and a joy be with you all. Oh, all the comrades that e'er I had, they are sorry for my going away. And all the sweethearts that e'er I had, they'd wish me one more day to stay. But since it falls unto my lot that I should rise and you should not, I'll gently rise and softly call, good night and joy be with you all.
Okay, that was again the parting glass, again, another side of the drinking song. This second album, again, is successful as well. They were kind of rising up the ranks of the commercial hierarchy in the music world, certainly never getting as high as the Kingston Trio, but getting more popular all the time. And so in order to try to make that next step, if you will, their manager, Marty Ehrlichman, thought that they needed some kind of visual hook, something to identify them, again, like the Kingston Trio. You saw that the album cover earlier, Kingston Trio with the matching shirts. Now, again, one of the great coincidences of this whole story, while Ehrlichman is looking for a visual hook, it just so happens that on one cold winter night, they showed up for a nightclub gig wearing Irish Aran sweaters, kind of heavy wool sweaters, that their mother, Ma Clancy, had knit for them because she heard about how cold the winters are in New York, so certainly you need a sweater. Though they wore them simply for warmth, when Ehrlichman saw them in the sweaters, he said, "That's it! That's the look I'm looking for." And this is the Clancys in their famous sweater, the image that I had for you before. So again, it's one of these, that became their defining visual mark. And imagine what it would feel like in those sweaters under the hot lights of a nightclub, or, as we'll see, TV. So this repackaging, this visual repackaging that I think, again, the Coen brothers kind of make fun of with the fat guy in the sweater, in their film, this visual repackaging occurred just as the Clancys had come to the attention of talent scouts from the Ed Sullivan Show, kind of a variety show, the most popular show on TV at the time. Good luck continued, and then on the night they were scheduled to appear in January of 1961, one of the headline acts, actually I believe it was Pearl Bailey, African-American singer Pearl Bailey, she called in sick, and so Sullivan had to fill in an extra 15 minutes. Guess who got the extra 15 minutes? The Clancys. And they became overnight sensations, if you will. So here's a picture of Ed Sullivan, an Irish name there. Ed Sullivan and the Clancys in their Aran sweaters. So think of it this way. Between the Elvis and the Beatles, there was the Clancy brothers on the Ed Sullivan Show. This was, again, their great leap forward. Following their performance on the Ed Sullivan Show, they were signed by Columbia Records and even performed at Carnegie Hall. In Carnegie Hall, though of course still in their trademark Irish sweaters. They kept climbing the ladder, and in 1963 they actually performed live on TV for President John F. Kennedy, of course the first Irish Catholic president in American history. It's kind of an irony here in many ways that the songs they were singing of Old Ireland was everything that Kennedy was trying to get away from. I mean, he was so airbrushed, so kind of waspy in his demeanor. And his father wanted it that way because, like, you're never going to get elected president if you look and act like an Irishman. But Kennedy was a good sport, and thank you, boys, and things like that. They were so popular that they, at the time, they were even considered for a TV show. They were going to be offered their own TV show. They actually did a kind of a pilot episode on a popular show at the time, Make Room for Daddy, with Danny Thomas as the star, the Lebanese Danny Thomas. So he was a Catholic, and there was some kind of connection there. But I remember I watched the show reruns when I was growing up, and he would call his wife Clancy. It was kind of a nickname, and so I think they tried to make her Irish in some ways. Maybe that's a little more. You can handle that better than Lebanese. I mean, just the idea of this Lebanese, star on TV in the 1950s. But again, he looks like a mainstream middle class dad there. But his wife's supposedly Irish. She has these relatives that are coming to New York to look for, to sing and to make it famous as Irish singers. And guess what? They're the Clancy brothers. And so there's a kind of a slapstick episode where they try to get into the nightclub, but they're not allowed because they don't have tuxedos and such. But so that was the pilot was successful enough that they were offered this TV show. But interestingly, they turned it down because they felt it was going to be a stereotype. That they were going to be something called in the 19th century the stage Irishman. The equivalent would be, like for African Americans, the Sambo character. The stage Irishman was that kind of equivalent, the Paddy. It's interesting that they rejected that because of those stereotypes. So pretty soon, as Irish music develops, the Clancy brothers will be seen as that kind of stage Irish with their hair and sweaters and stuff. But so again, they almost had a TV show, but they turned it down for reasons of principles. But their fame spread, and eventually, very soon, kind of spread back to Ireland. And they inspired people in Ireland to sing these songs that, again, for a generation or so, Irish people were ashamed of singing. It was a mark of being a peasant, of being backward, but now it was a source of pride. This is one group, the Dubliners, one of these they call them ballad bands, because the style, the songs they're singing was in Ireland, they just called them ballads. The Dubliners were one of the bands that, they were musicians before the Clancy, but the Clancys made them possible. They made their popularity and commercial viability possible. The Dubliners were one, the Wolf Tones were another, and you can see they have a lot more hair. Both of them have a lot more hair than the Clancys, and part of this is the progression through the 60s, certainly, with the counterculture that these groups had, let's just say, an ambivalent relation with. The politics of Irish music is very different from the politics of the counterculture, but still, you can see in pictures of these people through the 60s the influence of the larger culture around them, but still, they did, they kept to Irish songs and Irish music. These ballad bands, which were in varying degrees of musicianship, if you will, Dubliners had some real traditional musicians, but the whole point of the ballad band was to just kind of strum the guitar and sing the songs. But again, this paved the way for more traditional instrumental groups, like probably the most famous one, the Chieftains. This is a picture from the photo from the 70s or so. So the Chieftains very, very different from the Clancys, but the Clancys made them possible. Again, the contrast between the Clancys and the Chieftains raised this issue of authenticity. Just like playing a guitar, these songs, that's already, you're not traditional. Guitar was not part of the Irish tradition. It's an American instrument, and to accompany these songs with guitar, for a real purist, would be like, oh, that's a defilement. But when the checks started rolling in for traditional musicians, they didn't object too much to the Clancys. Not only did they make the kind of traditional instrumental music of the chieftains possible, but the chieftains, who were doing dance music, but doing it again in a different way, almost arranging it like classical compositions, again, very arranged. It's not something, no one would really dance to the chieftains' music, though it's all jigs and reels and hornpipes dance music. But the revival of traditional Irish music did lead to a revival in Irish dance. That became respectable, something to be proud of. And 30 years or so after the Clancys made their splash in the 1960s, we get river dance. That begins as a little fill-in segment on a Eurovision broadcast in the 1990s and then becomes a world sensation. And on top of that, following river dance, we also got Celtic women. And both these two, it's interesting, river dance and Celtic women kind of, certainly over the last 20 years, have become staples of public television and public broadcasting fundraising efforts. It was, when they do the fundraising drives for a long time, it was like, we're going to be showing river dance 24 hours a day, and if you donate now, you'll get the video and such. And more recently, Celtic women have kind of replaced that. Again, both river dance and Celtic women at various removes from tradition, but so too were the Clancys. Again, they never really claimed to be authentic, they just claimed to make the music accessible and entertaining. And so now I want to return to the Clancys' story and their fate in the 1960s. Again, this is the classic publicity shot from the time. Again, they had played Carnegie Hall, they'd played before President Kennedy, they'd reached the heights of the folk music world. In the early 60s, they still saw themselves as part of that folk music world, not a distinct Irishman, because a distinct Irishman didn't exist. So they're still very kind of much Greenwich Village people. Just to give you a sense of that connection, at the Newport Folk Festival, the great folk festival in America, in 1961, Tommy Makem was named, along with Joan Baez, as the most promising newcomers on the folk scene. So at this point, Tommy Makem he's in the company of a folk singer like Joan Baez, not seen as just an Irish singer. They were very proud of their connections to the Greenwich Village bohemian culture, and they tried to maintain those connections even as they tried to move out to a broader commercial world. But in the folk world of the early 1960s, let's just say the times they were a-changing. The original idea of performing traditional folk music in a manner as authentic as possible eventually gave way to a new ideal of composing original acoustic music to address first the political and cultural issues of the day and ultimately the more kind of emotional and even spiritual issues of the heart. And if this change has a name, the name is, of course, Bob Dylan. They're in an early post, one of these people trying to be Woody Guthrie. Dylan came to New York from Hibbing, Minnesota, and hoping to study at the feet of Woody Guthrie. Like Ramblin' Jack Elliott, he created a whole past for himself, kind of fictitious past, a fictitious American past. When he arrives in New York, he finds a lot of people sitting at the feet of Woody Guthrie, a lot of people who could sing better than him, play better than him, and knew more about folk music history than he did. But the one thing that Bob Dylan could do better than any of them was to write songs. His original songwriting took the folk music scene in a whole new direction. But before he emerged as a songwriter, he soaked in all the influences around him, including the music of the Clancy brothers. And many of his early songs were in fact based on traditional folk and Irish melodies. Just to give you one example, the last song I sang, Parting Glass, Dylan took that melody and reworked it as a song, Restless Farewell, in 1964. A song that ironically, kind of what goes around comes around, is now part of the repertoire of many Irish singers, I know, and music acts. I know I have a recording of it on the Dannon CD, where their singer sings it. So it's kind of this loop of influence, if you will. But the songwriting did raise certain kind of issues, issues of copyright, and Dylan actually got into some trouble with some songs he was borrowing or some melodies he was borrowing from the Clancy brothers' repertoire. It gets complicated here. Some of these folk musicians are taking traditional melodies and creating new songs out of them, but then sometimes they take these reworked songs and just put new words to them, and that's when you're getting into trouble. And this next song I'm going to sing from you is it's a rebel song again from the Clancy Brothers repertoire, but one that Bob Dylan kind of appropriated. It was written by Dominic Behan, who was a brother of the famous playwright and personality Brendan Behan, who spent some time in New York before he died. He was like the successor to Dylan Thomas in terms of these doomed writers. But the song Patriot Game, again, was written by Dominic Behan, who got into a legal battle with Bob Dylan because he said, you stole it when you did Dylan's song With God on Our Side, one of his protest songs. But I will play the Patriot Game for you as a kind of, again, an example of one of these reworked folk songs that is now kind of entering into the world of kind of commercial music and copyright. It's a song that's based on an IRA man who dies. Now, the political story, again, without going into too many details, when last we looked or talked about it, it was the 1916 rebellion that I said did bring a measure of independence. The northern province of Ulster still part of the United Kingdom. It is called Northern Ireland now, and there were some members of the Irish Republican Army who refused to give up the fight. And so there were these kind of various border campaigns even through the 1950s. And this is a song about one of those people. It's called Patriot Game.
All ye young rebels, list while I sing, for the love of one's country is a terrible thing. It banishes fear with the speed of a flame, makes us all part of patriot again. My name is O'Hanlon, I've just gone 16. My home is in Mana, and where I was weaned, I learned all my life cruel England to blame. So I'm a part of the patriot again. It's barely 2 years since I wandered away with a local battalion of the bold IRA. I had learned of our heroes, and I wanted the same, to play my own part in the patriot game. This island of ours has for long been half free. 6 counties are under John Bull's tyranny. I gave up my boyhood to drill and to train, and play my own part in the patriot game. Now as I lay here, my body all holds, I think of those traitors who bargained and sold. I wish that my rifle had given the same to the Chrislings who sold out the patriot game.
Well, copyright issues aside, these issues, the whole issue of who owns the folk songs, if you will, was quickly cast aside because Dylan himself made it, of course, everyone knows, a dramatic change in the mid-1960s. Just at the moment when he became the new thing in the folk world, and folk music became about writing original songs, Dylan left folk behind, went electric, and the rest is history, if you will. Now again, folk purists like Pete Seeger, who I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, they were shocked and outraged, and many other folk purists were too. The Clancys were hardly purists, but this whole revolution, rock and roll revolution in popular music, kind of left them behind. Just to give you some sense of this. This is the Clancys in 1966. So things are really changing in 1966. By 1966, psychedelica is starting to come in, but the Clancys are still playing with the whole joke about their sweaters and everything. And now, because when they started to perform, in nightclubs, they wore tuxedos, and then they went to sweaters, and now their sweaters off. We're kind of liberating ourselves. But it was kind of a sign that the act was getting stale, if you will, and it did break up around 66, 67. Some of them went on to pursue solo careers, most notably Liam Clancy and Tommy Makem. Paddy, I believe, just went back to farming. It was like, hey, I made my bundle, now I'll get a few cows and just farm, own land, which is still something that Irish people wanted at that time. But still, the Clancys found their niche in Irish music for good, for eternity, certainly to our own time. The Clancy Brothers repertoire is still the standard repertoire of St. Patrick's Day celebrations. People that, if you go to a St. Patrick's Day party and they're playing songs, beyond providing the repertoire for St. Patrick's Day celebrations, the Clancy Brothers and Tommy Makem did leave behind at least one original folk composition that is taken on the status equal to any of the more traditional folk songs that they performed, and that is Four Green Fields. This song was composed by Tommy Makem, seen here in an image from the 70s. The only real songwriter of the group, I think it's safe to say. This 70s image here shows how, in many ways, the counterculture certainly had its effect, at least on how the Clancy Brothers looked. The Clancy Brothers and Tommy Makem looked with these sideburns and the longish hair and such. Four Green Fields was composed in 1967, a pretty important year in popular music, the year of Sgt. Pepper's and the Summer of Love, when Western culture seemed more determined than ever to leave the past behind. But in this moment of, in some ways, kind of a radical break from the past, Tommy Makem is writing a song about Ireland and the kind of enduring political conflict in Ireland between England and Ireland that goes, for the Irish historical imagination goes back 8 centuries or so, and is still, certainly in 1967 and in many ways today, is still going on because of the problem of Ulster. The Four Green Fields are the 4 provinces of Ireland: Ulster, Munster, Leicester, and Connaught. And Ulster is still in the hands of the English. And this is something that seems kind of politically irrelevant to 1967 for the general culture, but very relevant to Irish people in 1967. Four Green Fields tells the story of an old woman representing Ireland who kind of tells, in just 3 verses, tells the whole history of Ireland and points to the continuing struggles in the north. Okay, so this is Tommy Makem's Four Green Fields.
What did I have, said the fine old woman. What did I have, this proud old woman did say. I had 4 green fields, each one was a jewel, till strangers came and tried to take them from me. I had 5 strong sons who fought to save my jewels. They fought and died, and that is my grief, said she. Long time ago, said the fine old woman. Long time ago, long time ago, this proud old woman did say there was war and death, thundering and a pillage, my children starved by mountain, valley, and sea, and their wailing cries, they shook the very heavens. My 4 green fields ran red with their blood, said she. What have I now, said the fine old woman. What have I now, this proud old woman did say. I have 4 green fields, one of them's in bondage, in strangers' hands, who tried to take it from me, and my sons had sons as brave as were their fathers. My 4th green field shall bloom once again, said she.
Again, Tommy Makem, 4 Green Fields, an original composition like the songs we began with, Rising of the Moon and Boulevard. They tell about the past, but they are meant to inspire the present and the future. Now, in 1967, in Ireland, this might have seemed fairly tame because the violence of the struggle was long past. But within a year, that violence would explode again in 1968, while the rest of the Western world is undergoing a cultural revolution. In Ireland, the battles of the past are heating up again. Catholics versus Protestants in Northern Ireland. Kind of euphemistically called the Troubles. This battle would rage on for the next 3 decades and take thousands of lives. And in 1967, Tommy Makem's composition, which, certainly in terms of popularity or overall cultural significance paled in comparison to something like Sgt. Pepper's, still in many ways was much more tied to a real history than anything coming out of Sgt. Pepper's. The mind games of John Lennon and Paul McCartney seemed, in comparison to the real fighting in Ireland, kind of almost self-indulgent in a way. And so Tommy Makem may not have won the battle for popularity or something, but in many ways, Tommy Makem and the Clancy brothers really did become real folk musicians because they sang, and in some cases wrote, for community. a community that was still very much struggling. That struggle, at least the violent dimension of that struggle, has stopped, and I guess we can be thankful for that. But we can also be thankful that the songs of that struggle and of centuries of struggle live on in the music of the Clancy brothers and Tommy Makem. Thank you very much.